Okay, so cytotoxic T cells versus helper T cell functions. In order for the immune system to be effective, it must take a proper, healthy response that's specific to the pathogen that it's responding to. Cytotoxic T cells and helper T cells are both part in making sure that the correct pathogen is identified and proper steps are taken. So they both kind of work to tailor the immune response to make sure it suits the pathogen. In order to completely understand the function of these cells, it's important to have some background information. The T cells are a subset of lymphocytes, which are important defense cells. They're part of adaptive immunity and are mainly involved in cell-mediated immunity. T cells are produced in the bone marrow and moved to the thymus, which is where they mature, and that differentiates them from the B cells, which mature in the bone marrow. But they're also identified by their T cell receptors, which are located on the outside of the cell. You can see that in the picture. These receptors are important when it comes to antigen binding and when it comes to identifying the cell and the antigen as self or non-self. T cell receptors usually only recognize processed pieces of antigen bound to the cell membrane proteins, which are called major histocompatibility complex molecules, or the MHC molecules. There's two classes of MHC molecules. There's class 1 and class 2. Cytotoxic T cells and helper T cells can be distinguished from one another by the presence of either a CD4 or a CD8 membrane glycoprotein on their surface. T cells that have the CD4 generally are helper T cells, and those helper T cells recognize the MHC class 2 complexes with their T cell receptor. T cells that have the CD8 generally function as the cytotoxic T cells or killer T cells and recognize the antigens with the MHC class 1 complexes with their receptor. So that's the basic kind of structure of both of the cells, which will help understand the function a little bit more. The cytotoxic T cells, they search the surface of antigen-presenting cells with their T cell receptors that we saw previously for specific MHC molecules. And when they recognize the MHC class 1 combinations on the surface of the cells, they then try to identify the cell that they've recognized as self or non-self. If it is self, then it allows the cell to live. It also looks to identify if it's carrying an antigen inside that is self or non-self, and if the cell is infected with a foreign antigen or if it's producing any kind of cancerous proteins or viruses that would be expressed on the MHC class 1 molecule, then the T cell recognizes that something is wrong and kills the cell, usually through apoptosis, or it releases a cytokinin or a structure that puts holes in the cell wall and eventually kills the cell. The killer T cell's main function in the immune system is basically like to monitor the cells in the body and eliminate any cell that displays foreign antigen inside of it, so they can kind of tell if the inside of the cell after it's already been infected, and that's when they can kill it. They're important because they're capable of identifying the changes that occur in the host cell after it becomes infected, and the MHC complex kind of works as a name tag. It kind of says, hey, this cell's infected. It lets the killer T cell know. Helper T cells are kind of like the instructors of the immune response, or as you can see here, it calls them the generals of the immune system. They tell the B cells when they can proliferate and differentiate. They suppress the immune system when it's overreacting or when the infection is gone. Helper T cells cooperate with B cells for antibody production, activation of macrophages, and inflammation. They need kind of to do all of this. helper T cells need many different types of cells to complete all of these functions, or basically like an army of cells to complete all of these functions. The helper T cells, they search the surfaces of the antigen-presenting cells with their T cell receptors, and they look for the MHC class II molecules on the antigen presenting cells, and they bind to them. When they become activated, they proliferate and differentiate into many different subsets of effector T cells. So they kind of make an army of different types of T cells, helper T cells, which allow for them to take on all of the jobs that the helper T cell has. So kind of to cover the different types of helper T cells, there's the T helper cell type 1, which regulates the immune response to intracellular pathogens or activates macrophages. There's the T helper cell type 2, which regulates the immune system response to many extracellular pathogens and antibody production in the B cells by B cells. There's T helper type 17 cells, which plays an important role in cell-mediated immunity and also helps defend against fungi. And that one's kind of a recently discovered cell. And T follicular helper cells plays an important role in the humoral immunity and the regulation of B cell development in germinal centers. So whichever helper T cell responds kind of depends on what type of pathogen has infected the animal. It depends if it's intracellular, extracellular, viral, bacterial, fungal, any kind like that. Each type of helper T cell produces a different set of cytokines that help them complete the response to a specific pathogen. Helper T cell cytokines, they create different responses, such as activating killer T cells to kill a virus or to kill the virus infected cell directly. The cytokines stimulate B cells to produce antibodies, or they stimulate macrophages to clean up kind of the dead viral particles. They also stimulate suppressor T cells to slow down the immune system once everything's been neutralized and taken care of. So helper T cells are important because they're kind of the conductor of the immune system. They guide the other cells in the immune response down the correct pathway and make sure that the correct pathway was taken throughout the entire response, not just the beginning of the response or one step of the response. So basically, when comparing the two types of cells and their functions throughout the immune system, it indicates that there's many differences between these two cells, but it also shows kind of how they both work together to completely respond to a foreign body. And they're both extremely important white blood cells in these bodies' immune systems. One thing that could be known as kind of like a real life situation is HIV is actually something that attacks helper T cells. And as you see, the helper T cells play a big role throughout the entire immune response. So when HIV attacks the helper T cells, it hides inside the genomes of the helper T cells, and it kind of, through clonal expansion, becomes more present in all the different types of helper T cells. And when it becomes more present, if it attacks too many of those helper T cells, when the immune system goes to take a pathway through a response, there might be too many different directional cues missing, so the response will not be correctly followed, and kind of like a downfall of the immune system begins. And it's just, that's kind of how the HIV attacks your body. So that shows basically how the helper T cells are very, very, very important when it comes to your immune system. And the cytotoxic T cells are still extremely important, but the steps that the helper T cells are involved in are so much more.